Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. This time around, we're tackling the war between Russia and Ukraine, the ongoing dispute that's been simmering away like a casserole for nearly a decade, only to explode into the full-blown fiasco that's dominated headlines since 2022. And according to some experts, both sides might manage a ceasefire come 2025. But before we pop the champagne and call it a day, there is a catch. That potential ceasefire is unlikely to usher in the everlasting peace everyone's been praying for. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
The situation in the battlefields of Ukraine has led to some hard truths being shared by the Ukrainian president, especially as the future of US support for Ukraine hangs in the balance. Zelensky has admitted that his country currently lacks the military capacity to reclaim the territories held by Russian forces in the Donbass, and let alone Crimea, where Russia has been able to entrench itself for the last decade. This truth does not mean that President Zelensky will just give up, however. His diplomatic offensive continues, and he has a very clear goal in mind not just for Ukraine, but Europe as a whole.
And what is very important, not divided, the same joint position of Europe. How to secure Ukraine, how to strengthen us, our people, citizens, civilians, and of course to do stronger our army.
In addition to strong security guarantees, one idea Zelensky has floated is a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine. This was reportedly a crucial idea broached by the Ukrainian leader during his recent meeting with the French president. An idea which Emmanuel Macron hasn't been quite opposed to, as he himself had suggested sending troops to Ukraine in some capacity earlier this year.
We are certainly approaching a moment in our Europe where it will be inappropriate not to be a coward.
Zelensky has also said that some European leaders did respond positively to this idea. It is currently unclear whether any EU or NATO member would be willing to take such a step forward, as many observers warn of potentially catastrophic consequences.
And now, as always, it's time to explore the issue in greater detail. Now, you might be wondering, why even talk about a ceasefire if it won't bring actual peace? Isn't that like receiving an email from your boss with the subject line, promotion, only to discover it's a promotion to office fridge monitor? Well, ceasefires can be temporary illusions. They give everyone a break from the daily brutality, which is obviously better than more violence, but sometimes they are basically a breather for each side to reload, regroup, and refresh the playlists of war anthems. It's an equivalent of a halftime show. The game is far from over, and everyone's just taking a breather before heading back into the fray. The reason 2025 keeps popping up in commentary is because experts see a variety of international and domestic factors converging around that time. Russian leadership, for example, might be hoping that Western support for Ukraine wavers. They may also bet on changes in US politics. Meanwhile, Ukraine will be looking at what shape its military is in, how the economy is holding up, and whether continuing the fight is more feasible than making some deeply uncomfortable concessions. But let's not forget how we got here in the first place. 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. The global reaction was essentially, wait, did that really just happen? Then came years of a simmering conflict in eastern Ukraine that was largely overshadowed by trending hashtags, celebrity breakups, and the internal debate over whether pineapple belongs in a pizza. All of that overshadowing ended in 2022, when everything turned from simmer to a rolling boil. And we were collectively reminded that serious international conflicts don't just vanish because we stop paying attention to them. And here we are now, with experts predicting some sort of ceasefire in 2025. It could be a big dramatic moment reminiscent of an awkward family reunion. Everyone agrees to stop sniping at each other for a while, but the tension is so thick you could carve it with a plastic spoon. Unfortunately, a ceasefire doesn't necessarily mean soldiers pack up and go home for good. It often means that both sides are done fighting for the moment, but they are not done glaring menacingly from across the table. Or the battlefield, or the internationally recognized border, whatever geographical boundary Moscow wants to be disputing that day. In essence, a 2025 ceasefire would be nice try, universe, but we're not quite done yet. For Ukraine, Genuine security lies in Russia's acceptance of its sovereignty and territory. But for Russia, a ceasefire might be a convenient way to show the international community, look, we tried to be nice, while continuing to exert military and political pressure behind the scenes. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Peter Dickinson, Ukraine Alert Editor, Atlantic Council. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So when talking about a potential ceasefire, one is immediately drawn to the question of stability, because if a ceasefire is fragile, it is not going to be very useful. How do you think this stability can be ensured at this stage? Who is going to actually make it work?
Well, you're absolutely right. There is a clear understanding, certainly in Ukraine, that any ceasefire without security guarantees for Ukraine will really just be a pause. It would be inevitable that Russia would use such a pause in hostilities to rearm, to implement lessons learned during the first phase of the full-scale invasion of the last 3 years, in other words. And then to resume hostilities, to resume the invasion, to essentially try to complete the conquest and subjugation of Ukraine. So it all depends on this key issue of security guarantees. Now, of course, Ukraine has been pushing for many years and continues to push for NATO membership. But there is also a recognition, I think, although perhaps not officially, but certainly unofficially, that is still politically very challenging. So if it can't be NATO membership, the question really is now, what kind of security guarantees could be offered that would be considered legitimate and credible enough to deter Russia?
So let's actually break this down. In terms of NATO membership, isn't this a mistake? I mean, offering concessions to Russia, understandably, it is something that has to be done to some extent. If you want a ceasefire, you need both sides to sit at the table. But to include Ukraine's membership as one of these concessions, don't you think this might actually backfire, and backfire badly at that?
Yeah, well, I think the position of the collective West, certainly some key members of the Western coalition, their reluctance to offer Ukraine NATO membership has been a historic mistake for a long time now. It's actually one of the causes of the war, of the full-scale invasion, rather. It's been a key factor for a long time that has encouraged Russia. You know, when Russia sees that its policies work in deterring NATO, of course they will continue. Now, Putin is like any badly behaved child. If his bad behavior is rewarded, it will continue. And I think in relation to Ukraine's NATO aspirations, that's very much the case. So it's certainly very regrettable. But having said that, we see a very clear political position from countries like Germany, also the US, that they are not ready to entertain the idea of NATO membership. They regard it as too much of a risk in terms of their own security. And so Ukraine is in a position where, yes, it continues to say, we must have NATO membership. It's the only way to secure a long-term peace. But in the meantime, they're ready, I think, to explore other alternatives simply because they recognize the political realities.
So now, speaking of what individual members of the alliance are willing to entertain, it does seem like the US is willing to entertain further support to Ukraine if Russia misbehaves. But there is another question, right? The question of what European countries are willing to do. Do you think it's going to be difficult to convince them to, for example, send in their troops to secure a potential demilitarized zone in Ukraine?
Well, yes, certainly it's difficult. Certainly it's extremely challenging. I mean, we're essentially, the entire idea of deploying large numbers of European troops to man the ceasefire front line or demilitarized zone, whatever we wish to call it. That entire idea, they're essentially hostages. We're essentially talking about these troops being used as a tripwire, really, putting them there as a human shield almost, saying, OK, these troops will be there to prevent a resumption of Russian aggression. The hope being, obviously, or the thinking being that Russia would not want to risk the possibility of hostilities with the countries that are participating. Now, is that credible or not? Well, that's the difficult challenge, and that's the question that will be asked in European capitals. I think a key absolute key aspect of any progress on this issue would be the simple matter of strength in numbers. If we had a critical mass of European countries, of major European countries, who said, yes, we'll take part, then I think it could become workable. But unless you have some of the big players, militarily and financially, politically involved, I'm thinking here primarily of France, Germany, Great Britain, then if you don't have those sort of players on board, it's going to be very challenging. That's going to be a big debate, and it's going to be hard to convince these countries to put their people in the line of fire for what could be an indefinite period. There's no indication that this is going to be a short mission. On the contrary, it would probably be for the long term.
But will these countries have a choice, though? I mean, it seems like Donald Trump is no longer willing to play softball. Instead, he says, I would be willing to withdraw from NATO if you don't meet your financial obligations, pointing an accusatory finger at certain countries that don't even reach the current threshold. Also saying that European troops need to be involved because America is not sending any troops. And once again, quite recently saying 5% of the GDP for NATO would be desirable, hinting he might be willing to settle for 3.5, perhaps, with certain conditions being met. But this seems to be this moment when European countries really do need to make up their mind. Like, if they want collective security, Trump says, well, you actually need to participate in that in a substantial way.
Absolutely. I mean, what Trump has made this a major issue of his foreign policy for many, many years now. During his first term, it was a major issue, the idea that Europe is not paying its way, that Europe must stop hiding behind America, must stop exploiting America's the security blanket that's provided by the United States. It must start paying its way, paying for its own security. So I think that the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion, now adds a huge sense of urgency to these existing issues, and Trump will certainly look to be using that. The picture that's emerging from the Trump camp now, he sends a lot of different, very mixed messages on the issue of Russia and Ukraine and his plans for some sort of a peace settlement. But I would say the overall picture that is emerging is that Trump will not abandon Ukraine, but he will look for Europe to play a much bigger role in the support for Ukraine and also in the peace, in any potential peace settlement. So I think that will mean Europe paying more for Ukraine, Europe providing Ukraine with more weapons, and Europe ultimately, if the plans proceed for some sort of a peacekeeping force, for Europe to provide those troops. So certainly it is, as you say, time for Europe to step up now. Trump is going to push for that, and that's quite clear. And there will be, I would imagine, a lot more a readiness in Europe to accept that this needs to be done now because of the urgency that's coming from the Russian threat.
So on the flip side, there doesn't seem to be much readiness in Russia to negotiate in good faith. Do you think that Trump is going to compel Russia to sit down at the table? Ukraine has indicated, well, we are willing, perhaps somewhat reluctantly, but we need to consider a peaceful diplomatic solution. Russia has been sending rather mixed signals again, but do you think that this might ultimately be Putin's undoing? If he does not sit down at the table, he will have to face further military support to Ukraine, and perhaps the situation on the front line changing once again in Ukraine's favor.
Well, that is the risk that the Russians will face now, I think. I think certainly at the moment, the way the battlefield dynamics look, the way the broader wartime dynamics look in Russia and Ukraine, certainly Putin will feel that time is on his side, that he is winning and he'll continue to win, that his position will become stronger. He sees that his troops are advancing on the battlefield, albeit fairly piecemeal, fairly small advances, but they are advancing steadily, if slowly. He sees that Ukraine is suffering from serious manpower shortages. He sees that Ukraine's allies are showing signs of fatigue. They're looking to get out of it. They're talking about ways to get out, to end the war. So I think there's a lot of reasons why Putin would be sitting there and thinking, okay, this is actually going my way. I should be waiting now. There's no reason for me to rush for some sort of settlement. But that might be a false image he has there. He might be overly optimistic. I think if he is the one who's seen to be the obstacle to peace, if Trump and Trump's team engage with him and come away from that engagement with a clear picture that the problem is Putin, that Russia does not want peace on any terms, or that the terms that it expects are simply too outrageous, are unacceptable for American, not even talking about Ukrainian national interest, but even for American national interest to accept, because Trump, with the best will in the world, can't be seen to look like a loser from this. He can't be seen to look like a pushover. And if the terms that Putin offers are simply unacceptable even for America, then I think the alternative from an American point of view will be, okay, well, we're going to arm Ukraine more. We're going to give Ukraine a lot more, and we could see then the tables turned if Ukraine were to receive large amounts of long-range weaponry, for example, with the green light and the authority to use them. If Ukraine were to receive far more in the way of fighter jets, drone technologies and so forth, this could have a very significant impact on the battlefield. So there's no, by all means, Russia will feel that it's in a strong position now, but if they overplay their hand in this negotiating period in the next few months, they may find that actually the tables are turned.
Peter Dickinson was our guest today here on Eastern Express. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight. And now we move on to Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. The European Union is looking to send a special message on the upcoming third-year mark of the full-scale war in Ukraine. Brussels is preparing to adopt its 16th sanction package against Russia on the 24th of February 2025.
Sources within the EU's diplomatic circles say that the new package will target sectors of the Russian economy which have remained unaffected so far. It will also address those sectors towards which the EU's response has been deemed insufficient. Other key targets of this package will be Russian propagandists, who are seen as responsible for undermining Ukraine's territorial integrity. EU authorities are also looking at imposing entry bans and freezing the assets of individuals involved in espionage for Russia. This includes persons who have taken part in disinformation campaigns, such as those seen in Germany. The EU's previous sanction package against Russia was adopted on December 16th. It was mostly focused on hitting Moscow's so-called shadow fleet of vessels.
Russian leader Vladimir Putin has met with Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico in Moscow. The talks reportedly focused on natural gas deliveries and were described as a working visit.
Slovakia's Prime Minister remains one of the few European leaders who maintains any sort of contact with Vladimir Putin ever since Russia invaded Ukraine. According to a Kremlin spokesperson, in addition to alleged talks on energy, the meeting also apparently served as an opportunity to discuss the current international situation. The visit had not been previously announced, and it is the first to Moscow by Fico since he returned to power. It has sparked concern in Western circles, as Slovakia is both an EU and NATO member, much like Hungary, which has also maintained ties with Russia. The Slovakian Prime Minister's outlook on the war in Ukraine differs from that of many of his partners in Europe and the wider West. When he returned to power, he ended his country's military aid for Kyiv and vowed to block Ukraine's NATO accession.
The International Monetary Fund has projected that the war in Ukraine will end in late 2025 or mid-2026 at the latest. This projection comes as part of the IMF's sixth review for Ukraine's economic situation under the Extended Fund facility.
The IMF report's prognosis for the war ending in late 2025 is part of the organization's baseline forecast. The 2026 prediction would occur in the case of a downside scenario in which Ukraine would require more than $177 billion in external financing. The report also indicates that Ukraine's economy has shown remarkable resilience, boasting 4% real GDP growth year-on-year in 2024. The IMF has pointed out that the winter season's impact on the Ukrainian economy may be lesser than previously anticipated. This change is most likely due to higher business investments in power generation, better import capabilities from Europe, and ongoing infrastructure repairs across the country. The Ukrainian economy is still beset with high inflation, however, and an economic slowdown is expected in 2025.
Moscow has expanded its youth militarization program for a long-term war in Ukraine. This expansion will involve, among other projects, an online platform for so-called military and patriotic education, as well as year-round training camps for young hopefuls.
According to the Institute for the Study of War, Vladimir Putin has issued new directives to push the militarization of Russia's youth even further, despite the country's very difficult demographic situation. These programs had been first ramped up in 2005 and then again in 2014 in the wake of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. They are particularly intense in the occupied regions of Ukraine, where they are meant to instill a sense of loyalty and obedience towards Russia among the local youth. Russia has already been using military and sports training camps to indoctrinate Ukrainian youth into accepting Russian cultural and historical narratives. This latest move is also seen as a commitment by the Kremlin to a broader push to militarize Russia's society as a whole.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.